go ahead and jump right in because we got a lot of stuff to talk about, and I'm very excited to be able to have this space with you guys. And there's a lot of really great workshops going on right now, so thanks for doing this one. We love doing workshops because it's interactive. We get to hear from you. So every one of these that we do is different, which is a lot of fun. So but first, before we jump into some of the content, Michaela and I want to share a little bit about our background. So I grew up in the suburbs of Dayton, Ohio, and did not have a whole lot of diversity around me when I was growing up. Didn't have a whole lot of cross-cultural relationships. So didn't know much about any of the stuff we're about to talk about. You're welcome, guys. If you don't mind grabbing one of each of those sheets as you come in, it'd be great. You got to work on getting a sheet that says grab one of those, please. So I grew up not around a whole lot of diversity. It wasn't until I went to Ohio State University, and that was a very diverse campus even when I was there back in '92, and graduated, and then I went on staff of the campus ministry, and then I went to the Middle East. So I lived in the Middle East doing campus ministry, learned Turkey, went to learn Turkish, and had a great experience overseas, came back, married my wife, and we went to New York City. We lived in Queens, New York for 5 years. Anybody from New York? Nope, okay. And we lived in Flushing in Queens, had a great experience there, and worked with some of the students we worked with in Queens, phenomenal experience. Please grab each of those sheets. Welcome. Phenomenal experience living in Queens, loved it. We attended multi-ethnic church when we were there, and this was really for me where I began to really process these things. And one of the things that struck me early on was the fact that I was like, you know what, it's actually easier for me to relate to people in the Middle East in many ways than it is for people of other ethnicities that live right here. So that was part of me just kind of sorting this out. How do we make sense out of all this, and how do we have a biblical perspective towards relating to people of other ethnicities? So left the staff of the campus ministry and started an organization I'll tell you about in a little bit, but Michaela's going to share a little bit about her story first.
What's up, y'all? Wake up. We got a hour and a half together. It's going to go real slow. Y'all like that. I grew up in the inner city of Toledo, Ohio. I grew up in a Christian household, but when I was a teenager, I got involved in the ministry. Not really a ministry, but it was called the Nation of Islam.
Welcome. Please grab some of those sheets.
And that was Louis Farrakhan, Malcolm X, power to black people, that kind of ministry. And I was all about white people are the devils. I had experienced a whole lot of racism growing up, and so I was right on that bandwagon. As later in my teenage years, I accepted Christ. I started walking with the Lord, but it wasn't until my college years at Ohio State that God really began to put his finger on the issue of the hurt from just experiencing a lot of racist things that had happened to me and a lot of bitterness that had surfaced. And he did that through a relationship that I developed with a woman who was on staff at Campus Crusade for Christ at Ohio State University. Her name was Carrie Walker. We went through a lot of ups and downs. It wasn't all lilies and roses. She said a lot of stupid stuff. I said a lot of stupid stuff. We had to say sorry 50 million times, but God did a really awesome work, and he used that relationship to bring a lot of healing in my life. And so I always say God has a funny sense of humor, so I went from white people are the devils to standing up here leading a workshop like this. So God's awesome.
Yes. So Michaela and I we started an organization about 9 years ago called Renew Partnerships, and what we do is we focus on helping Christians in this area have a biblical perspective to ethnic relations. So we have been doing this, had a lot of fun, a lot of different groups around the country, primarily work with Christian universities. But one of the things that's true of everything that we do is we are very, very, very committed to partnerships. So almost everything that we do is done with the help and input of a lot of different people around the country because Michaela knows a lot, I know a little, but we don't have it all figured out by any stretch. And no one does. Even when we talk with leaders around the country, all of us are in process of sorting this out, as I'm sure all of you are as well. So things that we do chapel talks on stuff. We do Westmont. Are you guys in chapel? Anybody in the chapel? Okay, yes, you work, right. So we do some of those things. But then a couple of things that we do that kind of play into some of the conversation we have is we have some scenario-based e-learning that we do that kind of focuses again on biblical approaches to diversity on campus, both for students and faculty. And then we do a campus-wide survey. So some of the stuff that we will talk about today and relate to comes from some of these things that we've learned in the process of putting these resources together. One thing that I wanted to mention before we jump into the content is, hopefully most of you got the card that was on the chair, but we have a survey. It's really short, it just takes about 5 minutes. If you guys can fill that out for us, that would be helpful. It gives us a little bit of context. There's a couple questions on there, like what works on your campus, what doesn't work on your campus. It's just on the back of the card. For the business card, you got one of those. It's just campus.renewpartnerships.org. So if you need one of those cards, it's on the chair. But if you can take a minute, just fill that out. That's helpful for us, and it also lets us know if you are interested at all in taking advantage of some of these things. that we put together, a lot of it is free resources, honestly. So if there is anything that you guys think might be helpful on your campus, please let us know. So before we jump right in, welcome guys. Hey, if you don't mind grabbing one of everything on the chair, that'd be great. Thank you. So before we jump into some of the things we're talking about, I'd like to hear from you guys. What are some things, I'll give you a second to think about this and then we're going to write it down the board. What are some things, barriers that you guys are facing on your campus? We can use all kinds of language for this, but how about for the sake of this? Barriers to healthy, biblical, ethnic relations on your campus. People of different ethnicities getting along well, really being in relationship together. Talk to me. Who's going to be the brave first person to share more? Thank you.
I think there are a lot of assumptions about what other people understand about you and don't understand about you.
Okay. Assumptions.
About other people's perspectives.
Okay. Yep. Yeah.
I think nobody thinks that there are barriers.
Okay. Yep. Should we call that maybe
Denial.
denial? How about that? What would we, do you like that word?
Yeah.
It's your thing. Okay. I'll put it on what I use. There are no barriers. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Past experiences.
Past experiences. Okay. Yep. Welcome. If anybody's come in and has not grabbed everything on the sheet or chair, please grab one. Did we run out of evaluations for us? I think we're done with the evaluation. Did we run out of evaluations? Yeah. I think we're... Okay, yeah, other things that are barriers. Yeah.
There's a lot of misconceptions.
Okay. Misconceptions. While I'm writing this, can you give us a couple examples?
Say for instance, if it's a certain brain group and another brain group, like, I guess they kind of talk amongst themselves and I guess they already have some preconceived notions about that brain group and like, okay, different ethnic groups.
Yep.
And they already have those conceptions and it's not right.
Yep, exactly. Yep. False assumptions, for sure. Yes.
Lack of people of color in leadership positions.
Okay. Yeah. Lack of people of color in leadership. Great stuff. I'm going to give one more, then we're going to jump in.
Colorblindness.
Colorblindness. Okay.
Thinking it's okay.
Thinking it's okay. Are you kind of thinking something along these lines, like the denial of barriers piece when you say that, or you think you have something else? Who said it?
Thinking that because we're Christians that we just need to love each other because we're all God's children,
Okay.
and not saying, I don't see you as this or that, or I just see you as a child of God.
Just see you as a child of God. Yep, and don't see your color. Yes. I saw two hands, and I'm going to get both yours before we move on. So I saw yes. Is that you? Okay. Yeah, first.
Ignorance.
Okay.
If you haven't been in an ethnically diverse area, you might not even, you get here and you're just like, what do? I don't understand any of this. I'm, fish out of water.
Okay. Yeah. Totally out of my element here. Never engages. Yeah, it's great. Thanks. And then I think you had your hand up.
I was going to say colorblindness too.
Okay, well, there you go. Awesome, great. Excellent list, totally agree. I think these are some of the biggest things that we see on the campuses that we work with. So great input there, guys. Okay, so what I want to do is we're going to talk a little bit, first of all, just about some hard issues around diversity, which you guys were touching on there a little bit. Boom, turtles. So let me get to that. I'll explain to you in a second where that comes from. So we talked about this. Now, you have a question, but what I want you to just think about just for a second, if you got a piece of paper, you grab it out and just jot a couple things down. Is there anything that keeps me from wanting to discuss ethnic diversity? And you just touched on it. Second, so let's think, what are some things for me personally? So we talked about our campus. What are some things for me personally that makes this conversation hard? This is what my list I think would have looked like when I was in college, something along these lines. I don't think it's important. I wasn't convinced at that point that this was even really an important biblical topic. Don't know much about it. I'm afraid I'll sound ignorant. I'm afraid I'll be misunderstood. I feel guilty about mistakes that I've made in this area, and I feel awkward discussing it. So a lot of the same things that you guys are expressing. This would have been my list, I think. Now, I think part of why we're taking this space at the start, we're going to get into some of those questions that are in the workshop description, you know, we live in a post-racial society. We're going to kind of get into some of these nuts and bolts things that are really helpful. But before we go there, we wanted to talk a little bit more on the heart level, because one of the things that we've learned, and Michaela have interacted with, you know, thousands of students around the country, is that usually it's not about a head issue. It's not about knowledge so much. I mean, I think the things we're going to talk about are really important, but really where people get stuck in this area is at that heart level. And so, and if you notice, I checked those things there, and you can even maybe do that on your sheet, for the things that are on your sheet, you know, which of these things are really heart level issues and not so much what I do in my brain. So we're going to talk a little bit about those things before we jump in. I want to share with you some of the things the Lord has taught me in this area. This is where the turtle title comes from. There's a sociologist named Robert Putnam, and he did this gigantic study of 30,000 people in 41 cities, and he came to this conclusion. Diversity, at least in the short run, seems to bring out the turtle in all of us. The more ethnically diverse the people we live around, the less we trust them. So there's this phenomenon that happens in multi-ethnic environments where we all kind of go into our shell, okay, for a bunch of different reasons. So some things that God has taught me in this area that really have been important for me to kind of break out of my shell is, one, is not to be too hard on myself. One, walk in God's grace when I fail, and have a biblical approach to corporate sin. So we're going to talk about each of those to start here. So I'm going to show you a clip right now, and anybody in here ever heard of a guy named Tim Wise? Okay, I see 1, 2, 3, couple. Okay. Tim Wise is a well-known advocate for anti-racism in America. He's very into justice. He, especially outside, he's not as far as I know, he's not a Christian. But outside of Christian circles, he's very well known as being a person who's very passionate about breaking down racial barriers and justice in America. I love this clip because in this recent video he made, he basically opens up about a time that he felt stereotypes. So here's a guy who's really passionately opposing things, but he's being honest about a situation he wrestles with. So let's watch this video. So this, as I shared, intro, welcome, just came in, good to have you in here. I just shared that it was very important for the Lord to help me to realize that there's spaces where I need to just kind of get some of this weight of guilt off of my shoulders. So another word for implicit is kind of automatic. I mean, he said, right? So I mean, there's kind of these automatic, unfortunately, and it is tragic, is that there's these automatic biases that are in our brain, first because of the way we've been conditioned. So it is very important that we learn over time, and with the help of the Holy Spirit, when those things come in our head, that we address them in our minds and say, that is outrageous and this is wrong. But that initial thought, that automatic bias, is not something we need to pile guilt on ourselves for, okay? So, and I think that's something where, as as believers especially, we're constantly under spiritual attack, I believe, in our lives. And I think that's something where Satan jumps in on, we have these thoughts, it's like, you must be a really bad person. You must be a really awful person. And that's part of that turtle factor where, when we start to own those things in our life, it can really be a hindrance. So I want to go engage on cross-cultural issues, but Satan's whispering in my ears like, I can't go have conversations about that stuff. You remember those thoughts you just had about those 2 pilots? You know what I'm saying? So we have to wrestle with those kind of things in our brain in order to be able to engage fully and not turtle up as we talk about cross-cultural issues. So one of my kind of practical steps for this is just to learn basic cross-cultural principles. So things like understanding, and bias, understanding how stereotypes work, understanding how our brains tend to put people in groups. That's where stereotypes come from. It's a natural phenomenon that our brain does, but we have to learn to address it, acknowledge it, and address it. I encourage you to take advantage of things that are happening on your campus that can help you learn these things. And then this is a book that I recommend, This Unity in Christ by Christina Cleveland. It has some great sociological principles, and she ties it to biblical principles and shows how those fit together. Another thing that I have learned is to walk in God's grace when I fail. So I'll tell you a story. In middle school, I had a group of guys come over to my house, and we're hanging out, playing pool. It was all white guys and one black friend, okay? And I jokingly made a comment to Curtis that at the time, I would have described as kind of a lighthearted jab among friends, okay? In hindsight, I can look back on that and say it was a totally insensitive thing for me to say that alienated and hurt Curtis and kind of separated from the rest of us. So those kind of things, and unfortunately at the time I didn't have the self-awareness to go and address it with him. And I might be the only person in the room who's made mistakes like that and look back with regret on things that you've said. But I think a lot of us have those things, and again, those can weigh on us, and they can influence our ability to connect. So when I want to go have a conversation, or I want to engage cross-culturally, here comes Satan. You can't have that conversation. Remember that stupid thing you said to Curtis? Remember that, Biola? It's those kind of weighty things, I think, which is kind of part of what everybody was getting at here, that kind of weigh on our heart and really complicate the dialogue. So we got to learn how to walk God's grace. Practical step is to be honest with God, yourself, and other people about your mistakes. And we want to, I put it with tact. We don't want to just dump everything that we've done wrong on other people, but appropriately with tact, we need to go and whenever possible apologize as individuals and address these things with ourselves and before the Lord. So, and overall, remember this grace, okay? So, last section here is the most fishy welcome. Hi, did you get that? I don't know if there's any papers left. You got her? Last section is the most complicated, and so we'll dive into this here, but I think this is something that I, again, have learned is an extremely important part of me being able to come out of my turtle shell in this area and to really understand, and this is something that is very, very, very underdeveloped in the Christian community, the understanding of this concept, okay? So, there is this idea of corporate sin. Actually, before I show that clip, there's this idea in the Bible of corporate sin that runs from Genesis all the way through Revelation. Anybody want to take a stab at what corporate sin is? Anybody want to attempt to give me your best words? What's the definition of corporate sin in the Bible? Yep.
Is it a sin that a group of people commits all together?
Okay, a sin that a group of people all can just go like maybe like a war atrocity or something like that. So we're sending an army out and we're going to genocide something like act together. Yes, I would put that in that category for sure. Yeah, a lot of people committing a sin together. I think that's part of it, but not the full scope of what corporate sin is. Mm-hmm. It's good. Yeah.
Can it include hereditary sin?
Hereditary sin.
Pass that from one.
Passed down from one generation. Absolutely, that's part of corporate sin. Yes. Yeah, we got that. Yes.
Sin is equal in everyone sins.
Sin is equal in everyone's sins. That's right, for sure, absolutely. And we're going to talk about all the different facets of sin and how Satan uses it to trip us up, for sure. Yeah.
Kind of like the sin of one that's representative of a group, similar to the story of Achan, where
Okay.
his family was punished for that sin of the one,
Yes, we do
because he was a
see,
representative of the group.
we do see that. We do see in the Bible, don't we? We actually see God in some ways, in a spiritual sense, we don't completely understand an individual representing a whole community. Yes, for sure. It's a big mystery. It's a big mystery, and it's a very strong theological. I encourage you. I mean, if you read commentaries, theological commentaries, I mean, they will address. There is very clear reality all throughout Scripture of this concept of corporate sin, and it is hard to understand, but it's very, very obvious in Scripture. Okay, so in Exodus 24:5, this is part of the Ten Commandments. We see God say, "I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me." That gets to your piece, right? Your generational sin piece, okay, right? So we see this idea of God punishing people for sins that were committed long before they were, not punishing, but he said, I will, yeah, I guess he is punishing in there in that verse. But I mean, God is basically recognizing and looking at sin committed, 100 years before we were born, and somehow equating that to us. Now, there's no such thing as corporate sin. That verse doesn't make any sense at all, okay? So another space that we see this all throughout the Old Testament specifically is leaders and prophets who are confessing sin on not just their personal sin, but the sin of their family and the sin of their nation as well. And we see that these confessions that the leaders and the people have in this regard for themselves, for their nations, and their communities and their families has a big impact. God hears those confessions and it makes a huge difference, okay? Now, if you are anything like me when I was in college, one of the first things that's popping into your brain is, that's not my fault, okay? So if you feel that way in any way, or you work with people who feel that way, totally get it. That can be a really hard thing, especially we're kind of talking about in abstracts, but we can very easily come up with some things that would be in this category for us. We could say, this was not my fault. This thing that happened years ago, this is not my fault. This is not my fault. I love to look at the example of Dietrich Bonhoeffer when we start having this whole question of those things are not my fault. Has any of you guys heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Show of hands. Okay, some of you have heard. Amazing life, incredible guy, had a huge influence, incredible theologian. He was a Lutheran pastor who lived in Germany around the time of the Nazis. So he was very adamantly opposed to the Nazi regime. In fact, he was sent to a concentration camp and he was hung by the Gestapo when he was 39 years old. So he died opposing the Nazis. So you don't have any better way of saying it's not my fault than to say I died fighting him, right? So I mean, he has the ultimate excuse to say I can completely disconnect myself from all of that horrible stuff that the Nazis did. But Bonhoeffer had a biblical perspective to corporate sin that caused him to make this comment. Okay? It is not only individual Germans and individual Christians who are guilty. Germany and the church are guilty too. Here, the contrition and justification of individuals is of no avail. Germany and the church themselves must repent and be justified. The people is to repent. But it's not a question of the number to repent, and in practice, it will never be the whole people, the whole church, but God can so regard it as if the whole people has repented. So let me ask you, that's a deep, he's a very deep philosophical guy. But what are some things you guys see in that quote? Talk to me a little bit. Excellent, yes. Great transition to the next slide. That's great, yeah. So the great thing is, for those of us who are believers in Christ, we have the perfect solution for sin, right? So that's why Jesus came. He came to give us a solution to all the different kinds of sin that you mentioned. Exactly. So Ephesians chapter 2 is one of the clearest descriptions of the gospel or good news of Christ that we have in the Bible. In the first 10 verses of Ephesians chapter 2, Paul basically explains how Christ has restored our broken relationship with God. Okay? In the second half of the chapter, in the last 11 verses, he focuses on how Christ has restored our relationships with one another, breaking down the dividing wall of hostility in that section, okay? So how many of you have ever heard a description of the gospel that focuses on both, that the gospel focuses on both the vertical and horizontal? That some of you guys have. So for some people, this might be a new concept, that the gospel isn't just about our vertical personal restoration with God, but the gospel, as we understand it in a biblical way, actually is very clearly about both our vertical and horizontal reconciliation with one another. That is what the gospel is according to Paul. He's a pretty good authority on it. And to your point, excellent, yeah. Not only does Paul in Ephesians 2 address this idea of the vertical and horizontal restoration, but he also gives some hints in there to the idea of corporate sin, but then he really clearly addresses it exactly in that passage you mentioned, Romans 5:18. Just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, that's Adam's sin, so also one righteous act resulted in justification of life for all people, and that's Christ's death. So we see a very clear, that verse is all about corporate sin. It's all him. Corporate sin and a solution for corporate sin. So, as followers of Christ, we have a solution for vertical division due to sin, horizontal division due to sin, personal sin, and corporate sin, all in Christ. So we don't have to shy away. On one level, I think, and this is where I was in many ways, in that kind of like, it's not my fault space. I wanted to disengage from that because I felt like that was too big of a burden for me to bear. And it can feel really overwhelming when you start thinking like, oh my goodness, not only do I have to deal with all the sin that I have in my life, but I have to somehow, in a sense, own the sins of the people around me and also generations in the past. But the good thing is we don't have to carry that burden because that's why Christ came. Okay, so we can understand that's a reality, but then we can put that on the cross. Does that make sense? It's a really, really, really important step for us in this conversation because otherwise it will be an enormous barrier to us. Okay, so the practical step, if you don't understand, or this is a whole new concept, you're like, whoa, corporate sin. Like, I tell you, take time to really learn about it. I encourage you to read. This is a great book, Bonhoeffer, Witness to Jesus Christ. It talks about his life and it includes a lot of his writings, including some of the writing he did. Bonhoeffer wrote extensively on the idea of corporate sin and just has, I think, a really, really helpful perspective on that as we think about even the past of our country and the injustices that have taken place. I'm going to talk about it a little bit. So, again, God's taught me not to be too myself, walk in God's grace when I fail, and have a biblical approach to corporate sin. So before we jump into the next section of this, talk to us. You guys have any questions? Clarity there? Cool, we'll keep cruising. Excellent. We already went over that, so I'm going to switch over here to all right. So, finally, to the title of our workshop, The Secret Ingredients to Building a Healthy, Multi-Ethnic Campus. Okay. So, we talked about what are some barriers. Now, we're going to talk about 3 questions that was in your workshop description. Don't we live in a post-racial society? Isn't colorblindness the solution? And doesn't treating everyone equally produce equality and unity? So, here we go. Don't we live in a post-racial society? I mentioned that survey. This is a comment that we hear all the time. How many of you guys on campus have had a conversation with someone who feels like we are post-racial? That's all? Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, right? Okay, yeah. So it looks like probably the majority of people in the room have in some level had this conversation about, don't we live in a post-racial society? Isn't it a bad idea to even continue to have the conversation? Isn't this totally pointless anymore? So, this is one example, I think, of something we hear a lot. I don't believe that in the generation I've grown up in, race is that big of an issue. I believe it remains an issue the longer it's discussed, as if there's racism where there's not. As a whole, the average 20-year-old is not racist in any sense. Today's college students are by and large colorblind. We don't look at someone's ethnic background. Okay, so we're going to talk about those ideas a bit. Okay, here's what we do, guys. Good. Introduce yourself. So we are going to imagine that we are going to the planet Zog. Okay, let's imagine that they have discovered this alien planet, and we are all going to be sent on this expedition to the planet Zog to figure out this new group of aliens. Okay. Now on the planet Zog, there are 4 different colors of aliens. You see them here, and the first thing that we observe is this is an aerial view of a Zogian city. Okay. Each dot represents a Zogian family. Okay. So the first thing that we observe is this is kind of what life looks like in a Zogian city. What are some things you guys see there? A lot of red. Okay, there's a lot of reds, yeah. And what else some things you guys see? Clusters, okay, yeah. So they kind of live in their own communities. Now, the next thing that we see after we've been there for a year is we discover these interesting cultural phenomena about the planet Zog, okay? Each one of the different colors of aliens has a lot of different experiences. These are all average levels, assuming equal populations on the planet, okay? Their level of income, how much money they make, are these levels. This is the level of wealth, the amount of money they amass. Okay, so it's kind of net wealth. The wealthiest Zogians, which of the Zogians have the most wealth? And so you like the top 300 wealthiest Zogians, like how, you know, what color are they? Education levels, lifespan, how long they live, how many of them are employed, which of them are poor, and which of them are in jail. Okay, so what I'd like for you to do is take some time right now in your groups, and I want you to do 2 things. One is talk about what are some things you go like, that's really interesting. So just kind of note some things that you find interesting about this information. And then secondly, I want you to discuss what are some things. So let's assume we discovered this in our first year on Zog, and we're going to have another year on Zog. So we really want to figure out this planet. What are some things you want to find out about the planet Zog that are going to help us to understand this information better? Got it? So what are some interesting observations and what are some questions we still want to discover about Zog? Go ahead and talk about that. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. All right, guys, we're going to wrap this. Sounds like a good conversation. It's great. So talk to me. Let's talk about observations first. Let's hear what you guys observed. It's like, that's interesting.
The wealthiest don't necessarily have the highest income.
I'm sorry, say it again?
The wealthiest don't necessarily have the highest income.
Okay, the wealthiest do not necessarily have the highest income. Okay, yep.
Same goes for education.
Okay. Which is, say, how's it the same?
Oh, because the wealthiest don't have the highest education.
Wealthiest do not have the highest education. Okay, yep.
There's kind of an unrealistic amount of employment.
Unrealistic. Yeah. It seems like, yeah, okay. It seems like, how can all these people be employed and get all this poverty? Maybe is that kind of what you're getting at? Like, realize people at high employment rates?
Yeah, we kind of proposed maybe it's an agricultural community because they have a lot of low-income employment.
Okay. So maybe they have a job, but it's not a very good job. Or it may not be a very well-paying job. Yeah, good observation. Yeah. Yes.
There's an inverse proportion relationship between education and in jail.
Okay.
The more educated you are, the less likely you'll be in jail.
The more educated you are, the less likely you'll be in jail. Good observation. Yep. Yeah.
Despite being fairly relatively similar in most areas, yellow and blue blue's much more in jail than the yellow group, despite everywhere else are kind of similar.
Blue is by far more in jail than any of the other groups. Good observation, yeah.
We're just saying how it seems the red is the wealthiest, so they have the most amount of wealth. However, the green have the highest amount of income.
Okay.
So if you possibly they weren't there as long because wealth also has to do with maybe property, land, or if the income passed on through generations.
Great point, and that gets often overlooked a lot when we have these conversations. Generational wealth and accumulation of wealth over time. Great observation, yeah. Good, you guys are all over this, is great. Let's transition a little bit into questions. How are we gonna really unpack it? You're kind of going there, right? So you're already there, which is a great question. So the question is, how has change over time influenced these factors? So is this something that was passed down generationally? Yeah, great. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm interested to know, like, kind of the history of the blue people because, like, they just tend to be in the lower class and in more trouble and stuff. And I wonder if there's like historical reasons that they do there.
Yes, exactly. What is it like, especially with incarceration, the jail? Like, what is behind that? Like, what's going on there? Yeah, great question. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious about their opportunity, like, to participate in education, employment, the types of jobs.
Yeah. How much opportunity do they have to engage? So are there like social barriers that keep them from being able to get certain kind of jobs, the kind of education they can get? Yeah, social society barriers, yeah, great, yep.
I thought it was weird that even though Red is the wealthiest of all the people, they have the third longest lifespan.
Okay, yeah. So they have a lot of wealth, but not necessarily long lifespans. Yeah, great observation. Yeah, can you think of a question that we could make? Yeah, so we're kind of trying to figure out like why is it like these guys are like they got all this stuff going for them, but they don't live as well. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
I was thinking like how do each color's own cultural values and like goals and expectations play into the results of like this chart? So like do some like the yellow emphasize more community-based stuff as opposed to individual wealth, and so they're a little bit lower on wealth, but you know, higher in lifespan or higher in whatever. So how does that influence the chart?
Cultural values, great question. Yeah, this sort out the cultural values between the different groups. Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna do one more, then we're gonna any other. Yeah, I got one. Okay, good. We'll go one, and we'll keep it.
I remember on the map seeing a lot of red and a lot of blue, but not a lot of green.
Okay.
Green is the most dominant of the colors. The most educated, wealthy, highest income. But also just curious, like why the green doesn't seem like there's too many of them, but they seem to be quite dominant. So.
Are you referring back to this map, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, so you observe why you put pieces together here. You're saying the greens, there's not many green dots, but they seem to have, yeah, good observation. Yep. Great, man, you guys are awesome. That is great. Really good observations, great questions. Let me ask you this question. In what ways do you think that our society is different? Like if you did these numbers for our society, what do you think would be similar and what do you think would be different? Any thoughts on that?
I think it would be opposite than what you just observed. Like the highest population in one country would be, like in America, it's mostly white.
Okay.
And if you look at the chart, that's like the highest income.
Okay. So you think that it would be like white would be
red?
Red. Okay, yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Things like lifespan and employment wouldn't be so competitive, so they would be they'd be more erratic.
You think it'd be more erratic up and down? Okay, yeah. And then employment would probably be more all over the place. Okay. Yes.
I think that kind of going back to what you said, like to the wealth, talking about the wealthiest, that it would be more like the 10% having like everything, having like 100%. It was just the person that like had all the wealth in the community, and in this instance, it's like all the wealth is spread out like throughout all, like the majority. And so it's a little opposite.
Okay, so you think that there would be a higher discrepancy than this wealth here, or would it be?
Like
feel like these bars
are portion of like the wealth.
Okay. So you think society is there's only a small number of people that can contain the wealth? Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, trick question. Sorry, I apologize for this answer. We're exactly the same. So that is data for us. This is America. Okay. So red is white, blue is black, yellow is Latino, and green is Asian. Okay. If you want the stats, you can snap this on your phone. I'll give that email to me if you give me your email address. I did this research just about a year ago with the latest numbers I could find. Okay. The city that I put up, that is Manhattan. I mean, that's New York City. So that's the census data. So the reality is this: we live in a racialized society. Okay. Race matters in enormous ways in our society today. Okay. There's a great book called Divided by Faith, where they write, "A racialized society is a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships." Now, here's where this gets even more sad, okay? What if we went in on the Plan Zod to communities of faith, and their communities of faith were racialized just like the society? That would be sad, right? If we went in there, think of the assumptions that we would make about their faith. If we saw that the pews in Zod looked like this, okay? The sad reality is it's even worse than that. in our society. We live in a highly racialized society, but our churches are far more racially divided than even our society is. So churches are 10 times less integrated than their neighborhoods and 20 times less integrated than public schools. So, it's even worse. Now think about the assumptions you would make if you went into houses of faith in the Zoggian planet, and their communities of faith were far more segregated even than their segregated society. And if that doesn't hit you in the stomach like it hits me, I think we're not really understanding it. Because that's exactly why a lot of people look at the Christian church and say it's a bunch of hypocrisy, or that's not the kind of values I want to live for, or this is a backward institution, is in part because we're living this reality out. And it's part of what motivates Michaela and I to come do these workshops, because we believe that you guys can make a difference in that. We really believe that your generation can start to turn this thing around if we're willing to own these things, claim what is ours in Christ, and come out of our shells and engage in community. We can turn this thing around. We can make a change. And I think we can make a change pretty quickly, too, if we get it in the church, okay? Let me talk about trends. So some people might say, okay, well, yes, we live in a racialized society, but aren't things getting better? Aren't they? No, I mean, we're seeing progress and great things are happening, and, isn't this thing on a trend down? I want to talk about trends a little bit. In some ways, we are seeing some progress, and in other ways, things are getting worse, okay? This is median net wealth of black families from 1984 to 2007. Okay? That is not a trend line down. Okay? White versus black families. This is it's a complicated graph, but I'm going to zoom on the last few years. So this goes from 1959 to 2010, and this is historical poverty rates. Okay? So this compares poverty rates in each of these communities. I'm going to zoom on just the last 10 years. So you can see here that these are the poverty rates over the last 10 years, and a couple lines are getting a little closer to each other, but some of them are actually getting farther apart. Does that make sense? So it's not like we're seeing this disparity in poverty is really decreasing rapidly at all in our country. This is one of the ones that really blew me away when I started understanding this, is that incarceration rates, again in that graph that we talked about, just an enormous discrepancy between incarceration rates. This is incarceration rates. This red line that you see going way up, this is black male high school dropouts. Okay? And unbelievable, more than 1 in 3 young black men without a high school diploma is currently behind bars. And you can see the trend line there. Okay? This is a fascinating graph. A whole bunch of sociologists put this together, so a lot of time on it. This is the difference between, with the amount of income inequality in a country, okay, how much does the level of problems increase? So they added a whole bunch of different types of problems in society, and they say if the income disparity is really big, does that have an impact on the number of problems? Okay, so we're looking at some countries here: Japan, Finland, Norway. So those are countries that don't have a lot of disparity in income. Does that make sense? So people make about the same money in that country. So as you go up the line, they found as they studied these countries, the higher the income disparity, the more problems there are in society. Okay? What country's missing on the graph? The U.S. Thanks. Okay. So you can see the trend line. We're off the charts, literally. Okay, so again, we can look at these things from all kinds of different perspectives, but when I look at it as a follower of Christ, I cannot help but say this would matter. If Christ were here in this room right now, I think he'd have a lot to say about that, right? I mean, this would matter to him. He'd care about this. So, Michaela's going to share about now we can get around to the second question. I think that's an incredibly important context when we talk about post-racial society before we can really engage the colorblindness question as well.
What I find interesting about this statement is if you've ever had to make that statement, the fact that you even made the statement says that you saw my color. Because I'm not gonna be like, hey dude, I'm colorblind. I would never say that to another black person. Like, why would I even make that statement? So the fact that you had to say that statement, I'm just colorblind, says to me you saw my color, and therefore that's why you made the statement. Okay, how many people in this room did not notice my afro when you walked in here? Anybody? Nobody on the floor there? I'm missing no hands. How many people in here did not notice the fact that I was black when you walked up in here? Nobody. No. Okay. So everybody noticed my color. So it's a lie. You're not colorblind. You saw that I was black. You saw that my hair defies gravity and it grows up. You saw all of that. So the fact that you have to make that statement says to me that indeed you saw my color. Now I want to give you a little thought, just to think about, food for thought. Because I think this young lady made this comment back here, and I thought it was very interesting, and I couldn't stop chatting, and I'll be like, I just want to address that. You said, it seems like when we talk about these issues, people get really emotional. And I was like, that's true. So let me give you a thought, a food for thought. Okay, imagine it's your first day of college, and you have 5 classes that day. I know, overachiever, you have 5 classes that day. You walk into the first class. You think you're looking all hot, you know, you got your cute little bootcut jeans on, your cute little boots. You walk in there, you do your thing, and then you walk in. Before you even find your seat, somebody in a red jacket looks at you, comes over, punches you in the face. And you're like, what in the? So you don't know what's going on, but you're trying to keep the peace, so you go to your seat and you sit down. All right, you go to the next class. You walk in, you're looking around, you're happy. Somebody in a red coat comes up and punches you in the face again. You're like, what is? So this happens 3 days in a row. And then on the 4th day you walk in, so you already kind of suspicious, right? 4th day, you don't get punched that day. You're like, okay, maybe it was just my hair. I'm gonna do something different tomorrow, maybe because it didn't happen on the 3rd day. But then on the 4th day you come in, you get punched again. And so at this point, on the 5th day, you walk in with your fist ball. You already, you like. So to answer your question, sometimes people of color who have experienced racism over and over and over again, even though you're not that white person, they've experienced the person in the red coat punching them in the face over and over again, saying racist things about them, judging them because of the color of their skin. And so immediately, when sometimes these issues come up, and y'all, and some of us on the other side is like, what they so mad about? I ain't saying nothing to them. Man, I didn't call them the N-word. I see if I called them the N-word. Yeah, but maybe somebody in the class before I even got to you did call me the N-word. But I'm already like, I've experienced this so many times. I'm ready for you. I'm in the position of, I'm already defensive. And so walking into the conversation, I'm not saying every person, but I'm saying that there may be people who may have experienced that. So walking into the conversation, understanding that, hopefully will cause you to walk into the conversation a little bit more humbly, a little bit more gently, and say, okay, this may have been the case. So even though I know I'm not that girl or that boy that did that to her, she may have experienced that 50 million times before I got here. So even understanding that, yes.
Sorry. Saying that, wouldn't you say that that alone can make people on the other side, people of color, become colorblind so that they can try to prove themselves that they are those stereotypes?
Okay, ask me that differently. Just to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying.
So like you're saying that when people that aren't of color like come into a conversation with color them to like that might be one of the reasons not to be colorblind. But wouldn't you say that a person of color that has been like stereotyped or experienced racism so many times that they might go to a new situation acting colorblind so that they don't get hurt again, so they can show and prove to people, look, I am not those stereotypes then.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. So you're saying if it was a white person coming into the conversation that they may go in acting like I'm colorblind so that the other person feels like they're not proving that I'm not gonna hurt you. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that sometimes people of color say that they're colorblind too.
Okay.
To kind of protect themselves from.
Yeah, that happens. That does happen. And across the board, the whole colorblind thing for me, and some people are offended. I can't say all. I never want to generalize. I personally am offended by the whole colorblind thing because I think it's, and not offended to the point of anger, but offended to the point of, that's ridiculous. Because the fact that you had to make that statement says to me, you saw my color. Like, come on, let's stop playing games. You know, like, it's like, let's just have the conversation. Like, what is it that you really want to say to me? Like, let's hash that out. Like, let's talk through that. And I'll say this too, like, My father grew up, he was born in the 40s, so he grew up in the 50s in the deep south of Mississippi. It was a typical thing for him to ride down the road with his dad in the truck and to see black people hanging from trees. He saw people get lynched. This was an everyday occurrence for him. He saw the white-only signs and the black-only signs. And so growing up with a dad who grew up in the deep south, this is what was indoctrinated into my ears. Never trust white people. When you go into a white situation, you make sure you speak proper and crisp English so they don't put you in the category of some ignorant black person. You make sure that when you're around white people, you tap dance and you speak well and you shake hands and you nod your head. And then when you get around us, then you can be like, girl, what's up? You know, that ain't cool, girl. Nah, But you're not gonna use ain't around a white person. I'm gonna speak very proper English so you know that I went to the Ohio State University and that I did get an education. Because typically people of color are multicultural and they're told one thing at home to act around the dominant culture, but when you get around your people, you can do what we do. And so for us, it's always racism, things of issue and diversity is always on our minds. But for some of the majority culture, it doesn't ever have to be on your mind if you really don't want it to be, because you didn't grow up hearing one thing and act one way with a certain group of people and another to happen when you're with somebody else. You know, when I went to Ohio State University and I met Carrie Walker, who was this cheesy white chick that grew up on the farm. I grew up in the hood, in the inner city of Toledo, Ohio. So we had a lot of engagements. We did ministry together for a few years at a predominantly historically black university in Ohio. There was a lot of things that happened in the midst of our relationship. And one of the things that I can remember her specifically making a comment, we had a conversation with an African American woman and she walked away from that conversation and said, wow, she's really sharp. And we continued to walk on. I see your head shaking. You already know where I'm going with this girl. So we walked away and then she stopped and she was like, Michaela, I need to ask your forgiveness for something. And I'm like, okay. She's like, what I really was thinking is she's really sharp to be a black woman. And that thought was wrong. And so she caught herself and she said, wow, like that was yucky that I even thought that. And she had that. And so she was able to process that with me. But let me tell you what that did. That wasn't the first instance. That wasn't the first, nor was it the last, where Carrie made comments like that and quickly had to come back as the Lord dealt with her and said, wow, I can't believe I thought that. That was so healing for me. You know, like it was healing for me to hear a white person say, wow, that was wrong. I'm sorry. And so for all those times that the boy in the red coat punched me in the face, it felt like just that one sorry was like healing, smacking me in the face. Wow, finally, somebody acknowledges this act of sin and they're saying they're sorry. One woman, we talk about corporate sin, let's talk about corporate, forgiveness. And that, for me, that one woman saying I'm sorry was healing for all the times that somebody had said something racist. So instead of you taking the posture of, I'm sorry that racist thing happened to you, but that wasn't my fault. I don't know why you telling me all upset and angry about it. But what if you just took the posture of Christ and just said, I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry that there's ignorant white people out there who do things like that. Forgive us, forgive me for being a part of a group that's happened to you. You have no idea how healing that could be in the life of a student of color. Just you humbling yourself and putting yourself in the posture and saying, you know what, I apologize for all of us, I'm sorry. Wow, that spoke so much healing to me. The Lord used that relationship in my life to bring me to a place where I stopped flinching when I saw the guy in the red coat. I heard somebody preach a sermon once that was so profound to me. He was actually talking about marriage relationships, but he talked about when a husband and wife get in a fight, he ultimately ended up saying, do you want to be right or do you want to be in a relationship? I thought that was so profound. I was like, I'm single, I ain't even married, but I'm going to remember that. I'm like, baby, you're right, because I just want to be in a relationship. So that's the question. When we have these cross-cultural relationships, do you really want to be right? Or do you want to be in relationship so that the world will know that we're his disciples by the way we love each other? So I think we can all agree that colorblind is not the answer. That will not solve the problems on Zog, and that will not solve the problems in the United States. But in essence, I would say, acknowledge my big ol' afro. Acknowledge my chocolate beautiful face. Acknowledge the fact that I grew up in the hood. And hopefully as we get to know each other, we can celebrate the fact that I love fried chicken and candy yams and collard greens. And I can acknowledge the fact that y'all love whatever y'all love. Carrie loved the baked potatoes with broccoli on them and some cottage cheese. I don't know if that's a white thing or Carrie thing. But I can acknowledge that and I can celebrate that. And you can celebrate when you go to church with me, you're gonna hear some organ and some drums. And I can celebrate the acoustic guitar. You know what I'm saying? So we can learn to get in each other's business, get in each other's space, do some salsa dancing, do a little cultural vibing, and get in each other's business and celebrate the differences and not try to ignore it and all look the same and be monotone. Because that's no fun. All right? All right.
Awesome. Thanks, Michaela. We're going to jump now to this last question that we were going to talk about, okay? Doesn't treating everyone equally produce equality and unity? Oh, I lost my screen. It just has to get turned on. Oh, right here? Yep. Okay. So what I want you to do is kind of get back in your groups a little bit. I want to talk about this a little bit together in your small groups. Really quick, I'm just going to give you 30 minutes on this. So now we're going, I think this question builds on everything we've talked about so far because this one gets really sticky and this one can get really hot and people can get really upset about this one. And I think what we have to take into this conversation too is one, we're not going to just wholesale adopt what maybe our cultural background has taught us, or maybe even what we've perceived. Again, we pointed out there are some things that the church has done that have been unbiblical and have not represented Christ well. So we don't want to necessarily just adopt what we have been given in that space, and we also don't want to necessarily adopt what society is giving us either, right? So we want to look at this from a biblical perspective and say, what is the true biblical way to approach this whole area of racial injustice and difference and divisions, okay? So we hear this all the time, again, as we work and we do surveys. We should not have special treatment for those of us who have ethnic backgrounds. I completely disagree with the giving of scholarships. Scholarships are a really sore spot, of course. Giving of scholarships to someone simply because of their race. How is that equality? This is simply being racist against the ethnic majority. We are all equal. It should be treated as such, no better, no worse, no special privileges. We hear this all the time. Okay? So get in your small groups, and I want you to talk a little bit about what is the biblical response to these things that we've been talking about. What should our stance be as Christians? Okay? So jump over about 3 minutes. Okay? So here is, you have a sheet that breaks this down, so I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Something that we call the insider-outsider principle. And again, we don't want to wholesale adopt. I don't think our society will, or even necessarily from a school perspective on this, or any, what we want to adopt is what the Bible teaches. And I am amazed by how incredibly effective, of course, God's plan is that He reveals to us in Scripture. I think if we followed this principle, I think it would solve a gigantic amount of issues that we observe on campuses and in organizations, okay? So, Jesus makes this interesting statement in Luke 22, 25 to 26. He says, kings like to throw their weight around, and people in authority like to give themselves fancy titles, okay? Those are insiders. Those are the people who have the power and the resources and are calling the shots, okay? Then he goes on to say, this is the Message Bible translation. It's not going to be that way with you. Let the senior among you become like the junior. Let the leader act the part of the servant. Okay, so he's flip-flopping this whole thing. Jesus is saying the way the world works is those people in the center, they like to throw the weight around, they like to get their way, they like to dominate everybody else, they like to call the shots for their own benefit. Okay? And those on the outside have to fight and scrap their way to try to get as close in the center. Jesus is like, nope. What I want you to do is I want those of you on the insider, I want you to serve those who are on the outside. I want you to wash their feet. Okay? So Jesus says, what it means to be a leader in my kingdom as my followers, and I'm not going to just talk about it, I'm going to model it for you. It means to wash people's feet. And if you want to be a leader, you need to be the world's best feet washer. So we see this total reversal, and it's not just something we see in Luke, it's in Deuteronomy, where all throughout the Old Testament law, there's a stress on foreigners, fatherless, and the widow. Who are foreigners and fatherless and widow? They are outsiders. Okay, so we see special provisions in God's law to take special care of those groups. They're outsiders. The insiders need to take special care of the outsiders. Okay? We see that also in Matthew 25, in one of the most convicting chapters in the entire Bible. If you haven't read Matthew 25 lately, please read it. Jesus is talking about who gets into heaven and who doesn't get into heaven. Okay, and what he says is, here's who gets into heaven. The people who get into heaven are the people who care about the least of these: the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and in prison. Now, I believe in salvation through faith in Christ, absolutely, but you cannot read that passage without going like, do I care about the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and in prison? Do I care about the outsiders? And do I do something for them? He doesn't just say that you care about them. He says, I'm doing things for you. I'm trying to meet your needs. I care for you, okay? So we have to factor that into our solution as well. And then in Luke 14, he's talking again about the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, okay? Who are these people? These are people who are on the outside, okay? So we're showing them special kindness. We're showing them special favor. All throughout different passages, in other spaces, we see slaves, women, children, Samaritans, Gentiles, Jews. In these cases where we see this special favor being extended, it's because in those contexts, those individuals are on the outside. And so the biblical principle is, if you are an insider, if you have the power and resources, then you look out for special ways to care for those around the outside. Now let me make one thing perfectly clear. This is an extreme, and two things perfectly clear. It's very important to keep in mind that this is a constantly changing dynamic, okay? So I'm a white male, so in most cases I have a lot of privilege, and people like me tend to be on the inside. But not all the time. When I walk into an African American church, I believe that they have a biblical mandate to show me special kindness because I'm an outsider when I walk into that church. Okay? So this dynamic is constantly changing, and so you might be an insider in one context, and then you might be an outsider in the next context, and that might be 5 minutes later. Okay? Does that make sense? So this dynamic is changing all the time, and of course it doesn't just apply to ethnicity. It's very much applies to ethnicity, but it also applies to gender, socioeconomics, even different categories of what denomination you're in. So this is a universal principle, I think, for believers. And just stop for a second, if we could pause, and just stop for a second. Just think what the church would look like, okay? Let's just dream for a second, okay? Just think what the Christian church would look like if we did all the time to each other. If we were always deferring, if we were constantly asking the question saying, am I an insider right now? Do I have the power and authority? Am I the one who gets to call the shots? Because if I am, then I need to immediately be thinking, who's the outsider? And they're constantly deferring and trying to serve it. Man, it would be crazy. And it would transform the world. One thing I also want to point out, secondly, is that we want to be very careful if we happen to be in a context where we're an insider, that we don't have a paternalistic mentality towards that. Like, oh, I'm the great insider with all my wealth and strength, and I'm going to come to you as this benevolent, kind person and give these things to you, because there's a lot of that too, right? And so a lot of the stuff that we do to kind of reach out and serve and extend to people who are on the outside, we kind of be done with this edge of like, aren't I a great person? Aren't I so great? And this passages like this really help us to not go there, because the reality is that Paul's right, your plenty will supply what they need, instead in turn their plenty will supply what you need. And he's talking specifically about some financial help there. But the point is, this is a reciprocal relationship, and the reality is that the insiders need the outsiders as much as the outsiders need the insiders. So this isn't just a one-sided thing. This is an absolutely reciprocal, constantly changing dynamic. So
we hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.